Hello 505, my name is Eric Lopez and this is my Module 2 reflection on our readings. So as America moved out of the 1800s and into the 20th century, schools underwent a significant shift. Prior to this period, schools had largely been seen as institutions for civic, moral, and intellectual development with a focus on classical education for the elite. This sentiment is supported in Larrabee as a new progressive belief in the purpose of education was being touted as traditional education is not just an ineffective method of instruction, but one that is misdirected and damaging by seeking to impose a fixed body of knowledge on the child at the will of the teacher. However, at this time, most children didn't go to school in favor of working, and they were okay with it. As shown in School Days, Part 2, by 1900s, 50% of children attended school, but the average age was just 5 years old. Spurred on by the Industrial Revolution and a dream of better life, an influx of immigration came to our shores and our classrooms. Now, a more holistic educational tenets, as well as vocational skills meant to leave. Now, I'm going to mess that up right there. Okay, let's stop it. We're a minute in already. 505. My name is Eric Lopez, and this is my reflection for Module 2. So as America moved out of the 1800s and into the 20th century, schools underwent a significant shift. Prior to this period, schools had largely been seen as institutions for civic, moral, and intellectual development with a focus on classical education for the elite. This sentiment is supported in Larrabee as a new progressive belief in the purpose of education was being touted as traditional education is not just an ineffective method of instruction, but one that is misdirected and damaging by seeking to impose a fixed body of knowledge on a child at the will of the teacher. However, at this time, most children didn't even go to school in favor of working, as they were okay with it. As shown in School Part 2, by 1900, 50% of children attended school, but the average age was just 5 years old. Spurred on by the Industrial Revolution and a dream of a better life, an influx of immigration came to our shores and our classrooms. Now, a more holistic vision of education began to emerge, emphasizing core educational tenets as well as vocational skills meant to leave the next American generation more capable of thriving a rapidly changing economy. This change was driven largely by the rise of administrative progressivism, the likes of John Dewey and later educational theorists, as described in Loss and Loss, who advocated for education that was more responsive to the needs of society and aimed at producing efficient and disciplined citizens. As David Tyack said in the documentary School Part 2, progressive education at its best is designed to tap all the talents of the student as opposed to just a narrow band of math verbal skills. This idea is further emphasized by a former progressive educator who stated the purpose of the progressive school is to make every working man a scholar and every scholar a working man. These schools also serve to indoctrinate new societies into what it meant to be an American and to preserve the American way of life. Conversely, as described by Rayner and Eder, Indian boarding schools were meant to strip these cultures of their way of life. The progressive movement was served a stunning defeat in the 1917 mayoral election of Gary, Indiana. Here, a flagship example of the progressive institution known as the Gary Plan was defeated by the sentiment of classism in education and with immigrants. With the onset of World War I, we see a push to return to the traditional education of civics-minded citizens, as well as a return of Bible verses and the Lord's Prayer in the classroom. Christian holidays were being observed in schools, and again, schools were seen as a way to mold immigrant children into Americans, while immigrants in turn saw school as stepping stones to success. In this aspect, my professional experience gave me some insight. Working in LA Charter Middle School with an ELL population of over 30%, cultures consisting of Armenian, Israeli, Hispanic, and Ukrainian, there were many times where we were teaching cultural traditions and norms. One such time, I was explaining to a Ukrainian student who yelled Allah Akbar and then proceeded to knock down the paper tower of a neighboring physics student who just stood there mouth agape. I had to explain to him that such actions could be seen as culturally insensitive, especially since it was the month of September. As the 1920s rolled through, we saw an increase in bureaucracy to accommodate the growing student populations and accompanying services needed. An efficiency mindset pushed administration through the science of education management, in which reformers sought to concentrate administrative power in the central figure of the superintendent instead of politically swayed local municipalities as described in Meta. To better identify student abilities and sort them into educational tracks, career tracking was introduced. I remember taking one in junior high and being told that I would be an architect. In this dynamic, only the brightest would receive college-bound coursework, while the rest of the students would be tracked into trades that they showed potential skill in. IQ tests were developed in World War I were integrated into the tracking of students as a way to identify capacity. However, the test was plagued with biases like vague questions, heavy use of synonyms and analogies, and the fact that the questions were only administered in English to immigrant students as young as the age of 5. These biased results led to claims that ethnicity could somehow affect intelligence. Schools used the test to identify future leaders, but had a tendency to write off everyone else. As historian James Anderson said in School 2, it was in fact a way to reinforce the kind of class, gender, and race prejudice that already existed in society. In the 1930s, a federal law banned the use of child labor and mandated school attendance of children through the age of 16. In 1945, we saw an increase in the graduation rate of 17-year-olds up to 45%. After World War II, the prevailing question was, how are we going to educate the middle 60% that won't benefit from college prep or career vocational training? Thus, the American educational institution returned to progressive ideals and the introduction of life adjustment education. This education included home ec, sexual education, dating etiquette, um, while also lacking significant rigor, prompting the argument that life adjustment education was pushing social skills over intellectual skills and that progressive education is regressive. This was further exemplified when Sputnik was launched and the rivalry of the Cold War spurred jingoistic fever, and again, continuing the theme of this century with the American Institution of Education swinging back and forth between traditional education and progressivism. In 1948, $100 million was poured into the public education to reach for the moon. Ultimately, the legacy of this era is one that educated students en masse, but one that did so differently. The shift in the purpose of schooling during this time was a direct result of the Industrial Revolution and immigration. Educators' aspirations were continually in flux between instilling intellectual knowledge and providing a holistic education to support the diverse challenges of students. While the economical push to educate the workers of today is in question, if not in peril, with the advent of AI, we do see a similar dichotomy in today's schools with standardized tests, or with standards-based education and social emotional learning, as we did in traditional intellectual-based education and progressivism. The shifts in the structural changes of schooling and in the organization of schools that happened during the first half of the 20th century left a lasting impact on modern educational systems. Still prevalent in today's institutions are the centralization and efficiency mindsets put in place by the administrative progressives. Additionally, the legacy educational bureaucracy has its place in districts big and small across the country, as every municipality reports to a county department of education, which represents the state government's beliefs on what should be taught, which in turn gets funding for mandates made by the federal Department of Education. Point being, bureaucracy is here to stay. The last legacy of the early 20th century of modern education I will mention is the standardization of curriculum. This is most visible by the continued use of standardized tests and national test books, but most notable in state-adopted content standards and the ideals of establishing uniform, high-rigor academic expectations for all students, regardless of zip code. Thank you.